There will come a time when you want to add UI elements, user interface elements like buttons, drop-down menus, that sort of thing, to your visualizations. Here's one way you can do it with D3. Admittedly, it's a little awkward. I would rather just use React or some framework, but I want to do everything in this course, at least, constrained to D3 and vanilla JavaScript, so here goes. Here's a simple app, a classic counter, so when you click on Click Me, it increments the count. Here's what the code looks like for this. It's in VizHub, and it's based on this pattern that supports hot reloading, and so it's going to start with main that takes as input a container. So let's take a look at the code. Rather than build it up from scratch, I'm going to just go through the code that I figured out already. So it starts with main that takes as input a container, which is a DOM element, and then these functions state and set state. We begin by creating a container selection by using d3 select container.attr class of UI elements container. And this is where CSS comes in. We give it a class so that we can style it in styles.css. And let's take a look at that. Styles.css, it's just CSS cascading style sheets, and it applies some styles to these elements. So for the top level container, we say, okay, display flex, align item center, justify content center, and we set the font family. And just so you can see what these do, if I remove align item center, it's no longer centered vertically. If I remove justify content center, it becomes left justified. And if I remove this font family, we get this serif font, which I personally don't quite like. So that's how we can style the UI elements container, which is defined right here in our index.js. Okay, now let's think about the shape of the state, which is the core piece of any kind of interactive thing. In this example, we have state.count. And state.count is the thing that increments when you click on Click Me. So this piece of logic right here just says, all right, if we don't have state.count yet, if it's undefined, which it is initially, we initialize it by calling setState, passing in a function that takes as input the old state, copies over all properties. I just do that as a best practice, just so we can scale the code and have more properties. But anyway, we initialize count to be 0. And then we return because the downstream code depends on state.count being defined. So that's how we initialize state.count to be 0. Next, we create the button. This code here creates a button with the standard data join, where we create a button element. We use the .text method on D3 selections to set the text content or inner text to this text here. And we can inspect the element to see what that really means. So within our UI elements container, we have a button, and the text of that is Click Me, which is set by that method there. So that's how we scaffold out the button. And then we add a click listener. This is what makes it so that when you click, it actually updates the count. So when we click this button, this function here gets called, which just calls out to setState, passing in a function that takes as input the previous state, returns a new version of the state with the count property replaced by state.count, which is the old count, which we initialized to 0 before, plus 1. So this is how we just increment the count. And when we call setState, that triggers the whole main function to execute again, in which case it gets down to this next segment that displays the count as text. Here again, we have a pretty straightforward usage of the general update pattern with D3, where we use an array with null as the data. This time we're selecting using div dot counter. I did this just in case we might have other divs in the future and we want to disambiguate, so we set a class of counter. This is also useful for styling with CSS. See, if we take a quick peek at styles.css, we can see that this CSS down here styles the output. We select the child of the thing that has a class of UI elements container that has a class of counter, which is this thing here. And we set the font size to be 32 pixels. Without that, the font is smaller. We set the color to be this sort of light grayish color. Without that, it's black, which I find a little harsh. So I like to make it a little more like gray. And then margin left 20 pixels just to separate it a little bit from that button there, which, by the way, is also styled with CSS. You could, and probably should, pull in styles from some kind of a CSS library, like, I don't know, Bootstrap or Tailwind. But just for the sake of simplicity, which may not seem simple, we apply all these styling rules to the button. And so the font size is 32 pixels, which makes the font big. We set the background color. Without that, we get some default. We set the color to be white, otherwise it's black. We set border to be none, otherwise we get this weird border. We set border radius to 12 pixels, otherwise it's pretty jagged. And then we set the padding, otherwise it's sort of, shrink wrapped like this. And by the way, this padding here is, well, let's just check. If we set that to 0, that's the vertical padding. And then this other padding here is the horizontal padding. And then cursor pointer just makes it so when you hover, it looks like you can click on it. It's an affordance of clickability. Without that, surprisingly to me, it doesn't have that. So it's not as clear that you can click on it. So that's how we can style the button and the output counter with CSS. And finally, the text that says you've clicked 17 times is powered by this code here, which sets the text of this div element to be this value here. It's a string template literal that says you've clicked insert count here times, if it's not 1, time if it's exactly 1. And this is one of my pet peeves. This is like one of the things that products get wrong all the time. Like, how many times have you seen something that said, you've clicked 1 times? I see this all the time. It's super sketchy. And let me show you exactly what I mean. If I refresh the page to reset the counter, it says here, you've clicked 0 times. Okay, that makes sense. If I click once, you've clicked 1 time, not times. And that's because we check, is the count equal to 1 exactly? If so, we don't put the S on the end. Otherwise, we do. And so if we click again, it says you've clicked 2 times. The S comes back. But where does count come from? This is actually state.count. And just so I didn't have to repeat state.count twice, I destructured it here as the local variable count from state. And this, by the way, is the same as saying const count equals state.count. This is destructuring in action. And that's it. That's how we can display the count as text, increment the count when you click on a button, and initialize state.count to 0, and style everything with CSS. And listen, I'll be the first to admit that it's a little weird to be using D3 for UI elements. I mean, you could do this with React or Vue or Svelte in a much cleaner way. But just for the simplicity of not using a framework, since we're already using D3, I wanted to show you that it is possible, and you can, in fact, build out interactive user interfaces with just D3 alone and vanilla JavaScript. This basic pattern opens the door to a lot of other types of user interface elements, which we could pull in from something like Bootstrap or other libraries like menus and radio buttons, checkboxes, text inputs, all that sort of stuff can be done with the same pattern.